Donald Trump tries to calm wary Republicans, and Hillary Clinton makes history as the presidential race is set after Tuesday's primary. San Diego voters set up showdowns in November in important races for city council and city attorney. And an easy cruise to re-election for Mayor Kevin Faulconer, whose style is very different from the brashness of Bernie Sanders or Trump. I'm Mark Sauer. The KPBS Roundtable starts now. Welcome to discussion of the week's top stories. I'm Mark Sauer, and joining me at the KPBS Roundtable today are Michael Smolens, politics editor for the San Diego Union-Tribune. Hi, Michael.
Mark, how you doing?
Good to have you back again. Scott Lewis, editor-in-chief of Voice of San Diego. Hi, Scott.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Glad you're here today. And Laura Wingard, news and digital editor for KPBS. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Mark.
Well, Democrats in California and across the nation made history by choosing the first woman to head a major party ticket for president of the United States. Here is Hillary Clinton acknowledging her historic victory, paying tribute to her mother, and taking a swipe at Donald Trump in the same sentence.
My mother believed that life is serving others, and she taught me never to back down from a bully, which it turns out was pretty good advice.
At the same time, the GOP nominee was being called out for racist comments about a San Diego judge and for lacking the temperament to be president. And this was from fellow Republicans. Michael, quite a wrap to this long primary season here, but not quite the coronation that Hillary Clinton and her supporters were thinking about, say, a year ago before Senator Sanders got in.
Well, no, and it is rather remarkable about the historic moment that we had, and that almost seemed to be a secondary issue. But I think part of that also is that we're so familiar with Hillary Clinton that the expectation that she would be the nominee might have taken a little bit out of the window of the sails of the fact that she's the first woman to be a major party nominee. As far as the race, people have been wringing their hands on the Democratic side. First of all, as a journalist, we thought it was great on both sides, but it certainly prepared her, if she wasn't prepared enough, for a fall race against somebody like Donald Trump.
Absolutely. Now, she noted in that same speech we played a bite from that her mother was born in 1919 when women finally got the vote, which is still kind of amazing to me. It was that recently. Now, is that gender, is that a hindrance or a help, or what impact in the fall?
It's going to be, it would always have been an issue with Donald Trump, particularly with his boorish nature about women and minorities and just about, any other group that isn't his. It will come to the fore, and I'm sure that will be. But I think that, again, just sort of speculating, it would be it'll be less than it would have been if it was a different woman. We're very familiar with Hillary Clinton. She's been on the international stage. Of course, it's going to be a factor. Plus or minus, I guess we'll have to see. I would think it's a plus because I think it would energize women, and particularly with the kind of candidate she's running against, perhaps those that might have been on the bubble as to who they might support.
Mm-hmm. Laura?
And I think because she is so known, it is a little different. We already know that Trump is talking and has said things like he's going to go after Bill Clinton and his philandering and how Hillary enabled him and that sort of thing. So those kinds of issues, I think, are going to come out and be said. And, is Hillary a sympathetic figure? I don't know. To a lot of people, she's not. She's, very controversial, and she's certainly gotten a lot of negative publicity, and a lot of Republicans don't like her, and a lot of Democrats don't like her.
Well, that was one of the questions I wanted to throw out to the panel today, and you bring it up nicely, which is, there's so many folks that just have this negative image of Hillary Clinton. Why do people hate her so much?
It's probably a coping mechanism in a way to make clear, why they're against her. You have to, drive up the hostility and animosity. But also, she has a lot of policies that indicate she'd be more willing to go to war on some things. Mm-hmm. She has she definitely represents a more centrist sort of neoliberal perspective. And so if you're of the socialist or very left-wing part of the party, that's obviously there's a lot of reasons to be upset with that. Mm-hmm. I think that on the right, they've been upset and dealing with her for a long time and driven up not only substantive policy concerns about universal health care that she puts to other things, but also that, some actual conspiracy theories and other things about why she is the way she is, why she took money from various groups for speeches and won't tell us what she said to them.
Yeah, Trump has hinted again she murdered Vince Foster, this aide from the Clinton years in the 90s.
Just had questions,
stuff.
Yeah. Just asking questions. I don't have any idea what's going on. I just wonder.
It's just astounding. Well, we'll certainly see as this thing plays out over the next several months. Now, we're talking about the big story now, post-Tuesday primary, is the Democrats trying to unite, this strong run that Bernie had. But he was close. He got a lot of votes, but it really wasn't nearly as close as 2008 when Senator, or at that time, Senator Clinton almost overtook Barack Obama, of course, went on to be president.
Well, that was another historic race. But, yeah, we often seem like that there are big movements and the turnout is going to be something different, bring in more people, and it never quite materializes. Now, I think that there were a lot more people involved, but we'll have to see when people really get into the numbers. There was a lot of the notion of, Bernie's army, as I call them, and the millennials, and did they get out and vote? There was some concern in California, certainly among the people walking precincts for him, that said, the rallies and the concerts are great, but that doesn't get people voting, and I think that they might have fallen short there. Mm-hmm. There were a lot of things going on. I mean, Clinton had clinched it almost certainly before then, but then the night before, of course, AP came out and said she's got the numbers. So that had a factor, I think, as well.
All right, we do want to shift to the Republican side. Donald Trump doubled down on his criticism of Judge Gonzalo, Curiel, a San Diego district judge here, saying he's Mexican, he's biased against him, he's unfair, as would be a Muslim judge, a woman judge, presumably any judge, as you said, who wasn't looking at the mirror image of Mr. Trump here. So Judge Curiel is a member of the San Diego La Raza lawyers. Here's what Luis Osuna, president of that group, said about Trump.
As a lawyer, as a member of our association, and as an American, I think it's insulting to reduce anyone to their ethnic or cultural heritage, particularly when evaluating whether they can carry out their duties as a judge or in any other profession for that matter.
All right, that was Luis Osuna of the La Raza Lawyers Group. What's the reaction been to GOP leaders to some of these accusations by Trump?
They're still wringing their hands a great deal, and obviously those comments have caused them a lot of heartburn. It's had people in difficult positions. Paul Ryan, the speaker, had sort of almost demanded him to take them back or criticize him harshly, but says he's still supporting him. So there's that weird situation. But I think that they're looking for him to act like a candidate normally acts after primaries, where they kind of move to the center, moderate, whatever. I mean, clearly he was going for what he was doing was working for the primary, and that probably won't work in the general election. We've seen some indications, some teleprompter speeches that have, sort of pulled in the Donald Trump excess, but then he'll go out and say something more. It's still... The Republican Party is in such a tough spot. This weekend, Mitt Romney's having his annual gathering at his lodge. But they're not even talking about the near future. They're talking about the post-Trump Republican Party. So it almost sounds like certain people have thrown in the towel in that regard. But I guess the big thing is, will he act like a normal candidate, try to move to the center, tamp down the rhetoric, and by October hope that a lot of this stuff people just don't really care about that they care about now? All
right, we got to move on, but 5 more months. We'll have plenty more bites at this apple as we get through the summer and into the fall. Well, even the opponents for San Diego City Attorney agree it's hard to get voters interested and to explain even what the job entails. So maybe it's no surprise that one of the top 2 candidates was, well, a surprise to a lot of people. Scott, will have a runoff in November, and who is it running off, and why was it a surprise this time?
Well, Robert Hickey is the only Republican of the 5-person race running, and he's advancing, and that was expected. The big contest was who was going to advance with him. And Mara Elliott, the deputy city attorney in the race. Now, what's interesting, she's the one that is going to run off. What's interesting is that throughout this whole, and my reporter Andrew Keats did a really good piece on this, that throughout this whole campaign, as this was playing out on the Democratic side of things, she would go from Democratic club to Democratic club to Democratic club, each seeking, they were all going to endorse. And they would always pick one of her 2 rivals, Gil Cabrera, or more often, Rafael Castellanos, but never picked her.
So she was striking out again and again.
She would pick her up her stuff and go to the next one, go to the next one. Goes to the Democratic Party, and Democratic Party decides not to endorse anybody. And turns out, none of that mattered. And she ends up advancing, and in large part, most people are assuming precisely because her ballot designation was deputy city attorney, which means that if you're a low information voter and you look and you see it's a city attorney race and there's a deputy city attorney
already in the office, must know her stuff.
Plus, she's the only woman on the ballot, and that was obvious as well. And so, it just shows that without a giant amount of money in that race, which nobody really contributed a significant amount of money, both between Rafael Castellanos and Gil Cabrera, it was a total of $700,000, which was less than the mayor himself raised. But also, Mara came in with like $100,000 or $200,000, much, much less, and she had a lot of trouble raising money. She's not going to have as much trouble this time.
Yeah, so it'll shape up. You think it'll be a closer race then as these two run off?
Yeah, definitely. There's the dynamics of a November runoff definitely favor a Democrat like her, but the Republicans will be united behind Robert Hickey. A lot of them are motivated by protecting the legal basis for pension reform that was passed a couple years ago. That is, it's the city attorney's job right now to defend that, the decision to keep pensions out of the hands of future employees, and so they're fired up to protect that. And that's going to be an interesting battle to watch, yeah.
All right, we do have a bite from Mara Elliott explaining how she sees the job.
For somebody coming from the outside who doesn't have a strong civil background or a civil litigation background, it'll be quite challenging. Even when it comes to our criminal division, Bob prosecutes felonies, we prosecute misdemeanors. It's night and day.
All right, as Scott was explaining, how do you campaign for a job like this when it's not that high profile and people don't know that much about it or the candidates?
Well, she did kind of fly under the radar in certain respects, but I think also, as Scott said, there's a lot of low-interest voters on a race like that, or low-knowledge voters, and who's in the runoff, a deputy DA and the deputy city attorney. So that, I think, was huge. I think that the fact that she was the only woman, but I think some of the candidates, were kind of bringing to it like they were running, for mayor or city council. People had homeless plans and other things. And I think that generally voters are familiar with what city attorneys are, and they're not the people that kind of come up with these grand plans. So I think that some of the tactics might have worked against them in that regard as well.
Laura?
I was just going to say that I think the fact that she came out so hard on election night to say, this is a guy who prosecutes gang, murderers, and that's his expertise. That she came out strong suggests to me that she's going to go at him, and I think it could be interesting.
One of the interesting parts, I interviewed each candidate for a long podcast, and she was the only one who said she doesn't think the city attorney should be an elected office. So it'd be really interesting to see if she pursues that now that she has a chance to maybe help them think of a charter amendment to change that, because I think there's a lot of people in the city that would be open to that, given the kind of controversial, dramatic city attorney things we've had in the past.
How might it be chosen, or how's it done in other cities?
Well, she worked at the county council, where it is appointed by the board of supervisors. That's where she came to the city from, and so that's what she said her model is.
Serve at the whim of those elected officials.
And that's her approach to the office too, is to be deferential to the city council and to the mayor, which is much different than obviously Mike Aguirre from a few years ago, but even Jan Goldsmith, the city attorney now, who gets involved in a lot of things and likes to be in front of the microphone. Right,
big personalities. Both of her two predecessors, big personalities.
The elected aspect of the city attorney does actually bring a little confusion to it, that what's their constituency? For the longest time, John Witt, you may remember, the longtime city attorney. I mean, he was the attorney for the city, and when the city was sued, that's the approach. Mike Aguirre came in, and of course, he was like the people's attorney, almost wanting to prosecute everybody at City Hall, so they would have to look at outside counsel at times like that. And to a degree, there's a legitimacy to that view. He might have taken it to an extreme, but what is the role when it's an elected aspect? And so, she thinks that there should be, clearly, according to her interview with this fellow, Scott, sorry. That she thinks that there should be a more defined, I think, ratcheted down role, very clearly that she's the attorney for the city.
Laura? And I think we should say, too, I think Robert Hickey, he has a lot of money. I looked before we came on, and he raised $442,000. She raised $107,000. He's supported by Bonnie Dumanis and other popular...
No. Bonnie Dumanis does not support Robert Hickey. Very much not.
Oh, she doesn't?
In fact, I would expect her to maybe support Mara Elliott. they have a very serious
Well, that's interesting
animosity.
because I thought on election night, in a very eloquent clip from him, he mentioned her and said, "I've been working in her office."
Yeah, no. They have a
I would have been under that same impression. That's interesting. Yeah,
hard animosity. In fact, there's a lot of great stories about how that plays out in that office. I don't know where it's come from, but she actually demoted him from a management role and has refused steadfastly to endorse him so far.
How interesting, because I just, as maybe a low information or not as much information voter, would have thought with his background.
It's actually one of the best stories of the campaign, really, is why that came about and how that'll play out. I would actually expect her to endorse Mara.
Well, then, does that bring up the question then in the fall? Endorsements, obviously, money always plays a huge role, but endorsements become that much more important. You're going to get those endorsements, as you said earlier.
Yeah, but, I think this really belies our understanding of money and endorsements in this race. I don't know how it's going to play out. If she can be known as the Democrat running, that'll help in the slate of Democrats. If there is an anti-Trump wave, which I think there's a good chance of in this heavily Latino city and other places, I just think it'll be very interesting to watch.
Okay. All right. Well, we will see how that plays out, and maybe we'll get that one race back on radar and a little more visible than it's been, certainly in the primary with just these two candidates. All right. We are going to move on. Speaking of coronation, San Diego Mayor Kevin Faulconer came pretty close to winning re-election in the primary, while hardly breaking a sweat. For a while, it looked like he might even run unopposed. Laura, how did Faulconer go from having to wage a tough fight in that special election to when Bob Filner fell out in disgrace to kind of having a cakewalk this time?
Well, it looks like San Diegans have gone back to their usual. We like those moderate Republicans who, when times are good, are good. And, he's had money. He hasn't had to do the fighting that you have to do. The unions are on his side because, he's been able to help the police and the firefighters, and, he's played up those things. He's got the Municipal Employees Association on his side when, the only issue that really came up during the campaign, the 911 response times. You have Michael Zucchet standing there. They were once rivals in what was a bitter city council race in 2002, and Zucchet beat Faulconer, but then they became the best of buds, and now they're standing, Faulconer's, there with Zucchet and Brian Marvel from the police union saying, we've got to handle. He's been the best mayor ever in years to help dispatchers and public safety. So.
Well, did he come along? Is he the perfect guy following the Filner Carl DeMaio show? People are maybe just tired of the conflict.
He's very good at identifying things that he can't change. If there's a movement coming, like to pass a climate action plan, rather than try to stand in the way of it futilely, he'll absorb it and champion it in his own. He's ultra cautious, but he's also hyper aware of the fact that he's kind of on borrowed time, in the sense that heavily Latino city with a heavy Democratic advantage. He's pro immigration reform in the sense of a comprehensive path to citizenship. He's pro, climate action. He's got embraced the Municipal Employees Association, the biggest city labor union. All of these things, I think he's recognized that, you can't fight everything in this role, especially as a white Republican from Point Loma. He's going to have to really, make it clear that he's not going to be controversial. Now, the question is, unfortunately, that lack of leadership has left a vacuum in some discussions, especially in the East Village discussion about the future of the Chargers and others, which means that other leadership comes up to try to fill that. And so, will he now take this mandate to do something special, or will he just keep letting other people define the city?
Well,
right,
Michael? I think also, Mark, that and we've said this time and again, that right out of the box after his special election, he was focused south of 8 on the more democratic, more minority, lower income neighborhoods, which, good politics, good government, whatever you want to call it, that was the more weakness. He was going to have the Republicans. And, it almost looked like Myrtle Cole, the city councilwoman from District 4, was his running mate at times. I mean, he was showing up in her district so often.
Francine Busby, the county Democrat, said he almost ran as a Democrat.
Yeah, look, I agree with Scott and a lot of people that there were no big initiatives, but I think he reads San Diego pretty well, like some of the other predecessors, the moderate white Republican mayors. The times are good now, so there's money. He can, give money out. There's not a controversy and a big fight over the budget. And also, I just think that you know, after the Filner meltdown, and as you mentioned, it wasn't just the Filner meltdown. You know, the two guys running for that seat, DeMaio and Filner, were just different kinds of mayoral, candidates that or mayoral potentials. Very controversial,
Neither
very
one very lovable.
very divisive, and so forth. I think, you know, we had so many elections. I think we haven't talked enough about just the stability that he brought. And it might have been anybody that got elected. I don't mean to you know, disregard his abilities and so forth, but I think that was a big part of it. But Scott raised the question, I think, okay, what next? He's termed out. You know, he said he's not running for governor. Things can always change. But, yeah, now I had always thought he was never going to do anything on the stadium until he was reelected. And then does that give him more leverage? I think it does. What he does with that leverage, and, you know, is there new negotiations at some point or something?
Well, that's the thing. This is his time to be a leader. I mean, you know, help the citizens figure out what is the plan? What are we going to do here? You know, the Chargers today delivered their, you know, signatures to the city clerk's office for their stadium plan.
Make the ballot then in the fall.
You know, and then we have the citizens plan from Corey Briggs. And, you know, it would really help to have a mayor who has, you know, won 58% of the vote to go out there and finally say, you know, what he thinks we ought to do. And he has just kind of dodged that question.
Well, we made that point a couple times here. How does he get away with dodging that all the time?
He has said that he's against the Briggs initiative. He said it's illegal according to the city attorney, so that's my position. So that one's off the table. You know, the Chargers thing is more nuanced, but you know, we've all written or reported or broadcast, you know, just for him to go for a tax increase just seems so unlikely, particularly with all the people, his allies, lining up against the Chargers situation. But, you know, infrastructure is the biggest thing going, the less sexy thing, but he wouldn't go for a bond that would increase taxes and has this kind of very middling thing on the ballot.
But it's worked so hard to keep the Chargers here. He's got to come up and say either we're going to go with the downtown plan or we aren't.
Like I said, it would be a shock to somehow in some way support this if it's on the ballot. What that means, and can they win without him, is the larger question.
Well, this does set up a bite we have, because he's very good at staying on message, and off questions he really doesn't want to answer. So here's part of his answer to KPBS's Steve Walsh's question on election night and whether he voted for Trump.
We've got to work closely here together in San Diego to do what's right, and I think that tonight's strong numbers across the aisle, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, I think affirms the right approach, not just here locally, but what we need to see more of in our state and in our country.
All right. Well, we will hear, I guess, not a lot from the mayor here, and he's going to quietly do what he's going to do because he doesn't have to run again in the fall. Let's move on to city council races where there are some showdowns in November. One is the big one in District 1. Democrat Barbara Bree almost won outright, got to 49%. She will face Republican Ray Ellis in November. Why is that, Scott, why is that race so important?
Well, the most significant one is it would protect the city council majority for the Democrats, which would mean, you know, this is technically nonpartisan, but in particular in the decision of who gets to be council president, it's very much partisan often.
Sets the agenda, what issues are
that's the priorities and agenda, and also creates potentially a rivalry between the council president and the mayor, unlike we've seen over the last 2 years. I think also there's there's different priorities in the balance. I don't think it's impossible still that she might actually get over that 50%. She lost a little ground yesterday, but a lot of things can change over the next few days. You can technically still send your ballot in at the day of the election now, and so, you know, those ballots are still getting counted. It's only
a ballpark on how many ballots might still be out there to be counted?
10,000.
Okay.
So I'm not saying it's going to happen, but I'm saying, like, I think there's a lot of even Republicans who are like, gosh, it'd be nice if this was ended because it's a lot of money and exhaustion to go at it again, especially considering that the November election, again, tilts more to the left, and so it would be highly unlikely that she would do worse unless something changed dramatically.
And this is an original thought that one of your folks might have said, but I wonder deep down if Faulkner is wishing that she won outright because he was all in for Ray Ellis, her opponent. Is he going to go to the wall for him? And the odds look really bad for him in November. I mean, if she almost won outright in the primary, even though there was a Democratic surge, primaries are usually better Republican votes, she would have to be the odds-on favorite. So if he knows this woman's going to be a key vote on the city council, does he start finessing his support at some point? Because he's shown that he can certainly work with a Democratic majority. And, she's not a real hard partisan. She's not sort of out of like the David Alvarez mode. She's an entrepreneur, got business sense. Sure. Not to say that she's not a strong Democrat, but she's the kind of person he can deal with. So you just wonder to what point is he, going to politically antagonize that eventuality, I think.
Well, what are the issues that would separate these two? I mean, in the absence of a mayor's race, maybe this stadium issue
I think
becomes
that's what's
bigger.
kind of fascinating is there's very little daylight between them. There's again, this pension thing keeps coming up because a lot of the people who want to protect pension reform are a little worried that she doesn't. That's the only thing I could get out of them about what they could specifically say. They were worried about different ones. And that's why I think it was so hard for them to distinguish themselves, because they ended up fighting about these highly technical arguments about the stadium financing and stuff that just seemed worthless.
And that's
Laura?
what I would say, is that they keep hitting on she supports the Citizens Plan. Both of them say they don't want any public money for a stadium, but Ray Ellis says, but she supports the Citizens Plan, and in a roundabout way, that could end up, if you have a convention center stadium, you know, if you build them together, somehow public money is going into that in a fashion. But how you make that stick, and I think just to bring it back to the presidential race, if you have a lot of Democrats showing up, if you have a lot of people, if you have Republicans that don't want to vote for Donald Trump and just stay away, all those are going to hurt Republican candidates across the board, and particularly somebody, you know, it could really affect somebody like Ray Ellis.
Yeah. Well, we'll see
in a
how
tight race.
we're just about out of time. We will see how that plays out, and turnout will be, as it always is, but especially this fall, a big issue there. Well, that does wrap up another week of stories at the KPBS Roundtable. I'd like to thank my guests, Michael Smolens of the San Diego Union Tribune, Scott Lewis of Voice of San Diego, and Laura Wingard of KPBS News. Before we sign off today, sad news from Hockey Town. Detroit Red Wings great, the legend Gordie Howe has died. Those of us who played and loved hockey growing up in Detroit will never forget old number 9. Gordie Howe was 88, and condolences to his family. I'm Mark Sauer. Thanks for joining us today on the Roundtable.